It is truly an honor to introduce Dr. Norman Finkelstein. He is a political scientist, an author, and a scholar whose work has made a significant impact on discussions surrounding Palestine, international law, and human rights. Over the course of his career, he has written extensively on the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, the politics of historical memory, and the ways in which international law is applied and oftentimes misapplied, especially as we see today with modern conflicts. Tonight's talk on academic freedom in crisis, speaking on Palestine today, comes at a time when open dialogue and critical inquiry are especially vital. We are grateful for the opportunity to hear from someone who has long been at the forefront of these discussions. And now, without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Norman Finkelstein.
Well, let's see if we'll get the microphone right. Do you hear me okay?
Great.
Good. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right, well, thank you for having me here today, and that was a mercifully short introduction, which is the way I like it. Took some time to get this podium set up. You know the joke, how many Muslim engineers does it take to set up a podium? Well, I guess you don't know that joke, okay. Tell another joke, but I'm not sure. How many, okay, let's move on. The topic I want to address today is whether Israel had a right to self-defense after October 7th, 2023. Now, that question, even though it was constantly posed after October 7th, 2023, that question was something of a misnomer, misnomer meaning incorrectly named, because Israel was not engaging in self-defense after October 7th. Israel was engaging in a genocide. There's now a broad consensus, I believe, on that fact. It began in January 2024 when South Africa went before the International Court of Justice and lodged a complaint with the International Court of Justice, the abbreviation being the ICJ. It lodged a complaint that Israel was in violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention. And from there on, a large number of meetings occurred at the ICJ. And the ICJ concluded that round of meetings by saying that it was plausible that Israel was committing genocide. However, it wouldn't resolve that question probably for a couple of years. Now that was 2024, so probably within the next year or so, the ICJ will reach a determination. For our purposes, however, the important point is that Israel was not engaging in a war of self-defense. In fact, the actual combat with the Hamas and other militant groups, the actual combat was very trivial in Gaza. There wasn't, and there couldn't be, in my opinion, there wasn't and there couldn't be any real resistance to Israel's assault on Gaza because the firepower was so overwhelming that resistance was next to near impossible. So as we proceed, I wanted to be clear that I am not talking about what has happened in Gaza, which was not a war of self-defense. It was a genocide. It's something very different. Time doesn't allow me to go into an exposition of why it's different, but the basics everybody here will understand. The purpose of war is to inflict a defeat on your adversary's army. That's the purpose of war. Now, of course, it happens in war that sometimes civilians are killed, and sometimes it happens in war that civilians are targeted. But ultimately, the goal is to inflict a military defeat on your adversary. And civilians who are killed, intentionally or unintentionally, it's still secondary to trying to inflict that military defeat. That was not Gaza. The military aspect was secondary. The primary aspect was the destruction of the civilian population. At the most elementary level, a war and a genocide, they are opposites. In a war, you want to inflict a military defeat on your adversary's army. Civilians will be killed. Sometimes civilians will be killed intentionally, but that's a secondary aspect. In a genocide, the military aspect is secondary. The primary aspect is the destruction and or extermination of the civilian population. What has happened in Gaza since October 8th, 2023 was a genocide. It was not a war of self-defense. However, the question nonetheless remains. You can say it's a hypothetical question, but the question still remains. Did Israel have any right of self-defense in Gaza? Obviously, it didn't have a right to commit genocide. That's, so to speak, a no-brainer. But did it have a right of self-defense? So, let's take a hypothetical. Here's the hypothetical. Imagine if you were told, or you read, that an African American led 40 other African Americans on a rampage, a murderous rampage. You read that this African American leader of this rampage, this murderous rampage, he issued an order. The order was very simple. Kill all the white people. And then imagine that these 40 or so people, they proceeded to do just that. They killed 55 white people. They hack women to pieces. They behead babies. Well, most of you, in fact, I would assume all of you, would, on hearing those facts, you would condemn this as a barbarous, a barbaric crime. But then you start researching what happened, and you find out that the 40 or so black men who committed this murderous, barbaric rampage, you find out that these young men, they had been born into slavery. they had languished in slavery, and it seemed as if they were to die slaves. You find out that this murderous rampage, women hacked to death, children beheaded, you find that this was their last attempt to overturn the system. They tried to create a national crisis. If you heard all that they were born into slavery, they languished in slavery, they expected to die slaves. And then they made this desperate attempt to foment, to create a national crisis in order to overturn this system. Well, what I called a hypothetical actually happened in our country's history. It was the largest slave revolt before the Civil War. It was led by a fellow, let's see if anybody in this room knows. What was the fellow's name who led the revolt? Yes? Yes, it was Nat Turner. And all the details of which I've given you a few are exactly what happened. Now, it's interesting to look at what was the reaction to the Nat Turner revolt. In particular, there were a group of people who fought very heroically to end slavery. And they were called, what were they called, young men? Yes. Yeah. I thought you would know. They were called the abolitionists, black and white. They campaigned with great heroism and just a very impressive moral commitment, conviction to ending slavery. And in the midst of their struggle to end slavery, there's the Nat Turner revolt. It's interesting to read the abolitionists who were completely against violence. They believed in what they called moral suasion. Moral suasion simply means to try to persuade your fellow Americans that slavery is wrong. They were absolutely against violence. However, if you read them, at the time of the Nat Turner Rebellion, they did not condemn what Nat Turner did. They did not. They condemned white people for creating this system that drove the slaves to commit barbarous acts. One of the most famous of the abolitionists was a fellow named William Lloyd Garrison. And when he had to comment on the Nat Turner revolt, he said, "There's no question in my mind, horrible things happened during those 1.5 days. No question about it." But then he said, quote, "We have warned our countrymen of the danger of persisting in their unrighteous conduct." They didn't condemn Nat Turner. They condemned the country that persisted in this system of slavery, which created a Nat Turner. There was a progressive, that's the word they use nowadays, a progressive working class party from, of all places, New York City. And here's what it had to say. "Of what were the Negroes guilty, meaning the Nat Turner and his 40 Confederates, of putting to death men, women, and children? For what object? Robbery? Theft? No. There's no evidence that such was their object. On the contrary, almost all the accounts concur in stating that they expected, what did they expect? They expected to emancipate themselves. They expected to free themselves. And they no doubt thought that their only hope of doing so was to put to death indiscriminately the whole race of those who held them in bondage. If such were their impressions, if that's what they believed, the only way they could be free was to put to death all those who held them in bondage. Were they not justifiable in doing so? Undoubtedly they were. Undoubtedly they were. If freedom is the birthright of man, as the Declaration of Independence tells us, one of probably the most famous black abolitionists, who knows who's the most famous black abolitionist? Anyone? Yes. Yes, Frederick Douglass, good. And Frederick Douglass, he was as opposed to violence as any of the abolitionists. However, is there a problem? Please speak. Okay, I thought I did a mic check, but maybe I didn't succeed. Okay, so let's try now. Is that better? Is that better? Okay. But Frederick Douglass, he nonetheless called Nat Turner, who led a rebellion, hacking to death women, beheading babies. He nonetheless called Nat Turner. He said, allow me a moment. He called Nat Turner one of our revolutionary fathers and one of our glorious martyrs. Well, that was the Nat Turner Rebellion. Now, let's turn to Gaza. Everything I'm about to tell you, let me preface, was before October 7th. It's the build-up to October 7th. Gaza was always a forbidding place. A U.S. Senator, how many of you remember the U.S. Senator Al Gore? He ran for president. Good, he ran for president in 2000. Al Gore's father was a senator as well. In 1967, after Israel occupied Gaza during the June 1967 war, Al Gore, he visits Gaza. How did he describe it? Let me quote you. A vast concentration camp on the sand, if you will. In 2004, Israel's head of its National Security Council, a fellow named Giora Eiland, he's still among the living. He's one of the advisors to the genocide in Gaza. So you can't say he's a peacenik. He was a typical Israeli monster. In 2004, He's having a conversation with some American U.S. interlocutors. How does he describe Gaza? I'm quoting him, Gaza, it's a huge concentration camp. That's Giora Island. For those of you who have those godforsaken devices called iPhones, if you Google island, E-I-L-A-N-D, and you Google March 2004, it's going to, and concentration camp, it's going to come right up. Now, believe it or not, when those two gentlemen, our senator and Israel's head of the National Security Council, when they were speaking about Gaza, that was Gaza in its paradise days. That's a fact. In 2006, our president, George Bush, W. Bush, he says the Palestinians have to hold elections in the occupied Palestinian territories. Back then it was called democracy promotion. They hold the elections, but then there's a problem. Or I should say, Jimmy Carter, the former US president, and even though he was an awful president, he lived a wonderful after presidency, post-presidency. Extremely decent guy, extremely smart guy, very smart guy, as compared to our current president. Jimmy Carter used to read, believe it or not, and he was not a liar, he was a very honest guy. Honest guy. Terrible president, I'm not going to dispute that, but honest guy. He used to read 3 to 4 books a week. That's a fact. 3 to 4 books a week. During his presidency, he read 300 pages a night. That's a fact. Very impressive guy. Current president, very doubtful. 2 to 3 books in this 3 to 4 books in his entire life. No, it's really very doubtful. There are reports he's never read a book in his life, and I think that's plausible. Even the books about him, he just doesn't have that mental discipline. Every night, not 300 pages. I do believe he reads 300 tweets. I do think that's plausible, in my opinion. In any case, Jimmy Carter, very smart guy and decent guy, and one of the things he did in his post-presidency was he monitored elections. He was in Gaza in the 2006 parliamentary elections, and he pronounced them, quote, they were fully fair and free elections. Problem was, the wrong side won. Hamas won. In fact, Hamas didn't want to participate in the elections. They felt the elections were designed to justify what was called, to legitimize what they called the Oslo process, meaning the system of Israeli occupation through Palestinians that began in Oslo in September 1993. So, he pronounced the elections completely honest and fair. The wrong side won, and because the wrong side won, Hamas, the Israelis imposed a blockade on Gaza, this medieval blockade, immediately supported by the US and then supported by the EU. You want to have a taste, so to speak, of what this blockade was like. The blockade banned spices from entering Gaza. It banned jam from entering Gaza. It banned vinegar from entering Gaza. It banned nutmeg from entering Gaza. It banned chocolate from entering Gaza. It banned fruit preserves from entering Gaza. It banned nuts from entering Gaza. It banned biscuits from entering Gaza. It banned potato chips from entering Gaza. It banned musical instruments, notebooks, toys, baby chicks, goats from entering Gaza. It put, literally, some of this may sound sort of science fiction, but it's the fact, it's the written record. It put the people of Gaza on what the Israelis called a humanitarian minimum diet. That is, it calculated the caloric intake of the population of Gaza and then admitted enough food such that there wouldn't be starvation, but nothing more. A humanitarian minimum. Why? The Israelis were very honest about it. They said, quote, "We want to keep Gaza, the Gazan economy on the brink of collapse without quite pushing it over the edge." They wanted to create enough misery in Gaza that the population would reconsider its decision to elect Hamas into power. By 2008-9, the UN humanitarian chief, her name was Mary Robinson. She's still among the living. This is what she had to say about the situation in Gaza. Gaza's whole civilization has been destroyed. I'm not exaggerating. Its whole civilization had been destroyed. By October 7th, I should say by the eve of October 7th, the night of October 6th, the British Economist magazine, it described Gaza as having been reduced to a human rubbish heap. The Red Cross described Gaza as a sinking ship. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights described Gaza as a toxic slum in which more than 2 million people, half of them children, were caged from birth to death. That was Gaza. We're not talking about post-October 7th. We're talking about the Gaza that created October 7th. But that's just a part of what happened. Because periodically, Israel attacked Gaza. These high-tech killing sprees, what Israel called mowing the lawn in Gaza, which was an interesting metaphor, because half of the heads that were caught in the blades of the mowers were children. Mowing the lawn in Gaza. There was Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9. There was Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012. And there was Operation Protective Edge in 2014. What did these operations look like? These mowings of the lawn? I'm not going to give you any secondhand accounts. I will give you the first-hand accounts, not of the victims, but of the perpetrators. There was an organization in Israel, it's still around, but much less active, called Breaking the Silence. It comprised ex-IDF, Israel Defense Forces, soldiers. And they would compile the testimonies of the soldiers about what they did in Gaza. Now, these soldiers, they were not peaceniks. There were no apologies in their testimonies. They were just matter-of-fact descriptions of what they did in Gaza. So, I'm just going to read you at random some of the descriptions. For those of you who are interested, again, just go to your iPhone and Google Breaking the Silence Operation Protective Edge, and you'll get a 267-page collection. So let me read to you what it was like during these periodic operations in Gaza. When we left after the operation, Gaza, it was just a barren stretch of desert. We spoke about it a lot among ourselves. The guys from the company, how crazy the amount of damage we did there was. Listen, man, we really messed them up. F, the F word, F, check it out. There's nothing at all left. It's nothing but desert now. That's crazy. Soldier, I remember that the level of destruction looked insane to me. Soldier, we entered Gaza with an insane amount of firepower. Soldier, it all looked like a science fiction movie. Serious levels of destruction everywhere. Everything was really in ruins, and non-stop fire all the time. Soldier, before the entrance on foot, a crazy amount of artillery was fired at the entire area. Before a tank makes any movement, it fires every time. Those guys, they were trigger happy, totally crazy. Soldier, the explosion's effects cause major amounts of damage, but that doesn't interest anyone. Quote, use it, explosives can't be taken back, the platoon commander says. I don't want to leave explosives with me. Soldier, you saw crazy wreckage. It was a real trip. Soldier, our view was of the center of the strip. Let's say it was a real fireworks display. From a distance, it looked pretty cool. Soldier, you're shooting at anything that moves, and also what isn't moving, crazy amounts. It also becomes a bit like a computer game, totally cool and real. Soldier, it was total destruction in there. The photos online are child's play compared to what we saw there in reality. I never saw anything like it. Soldier, the unfathomable number of dead, the unimaginable level of destruction, the way militant cells and people were regarded as targets and not as living beings. That's something that troubles me. Soldier, it's destruction on a whole other level. Soldier, The Air Force carries out an insane amount of strikes in the Gaza Strip during an operation like Protective Edge. Soldier, shells are being fired all the time. Even if we aren't actually going to enter, shells, shells, shells. What happens is, for 7 straight days, it's nonstop bombardment. That's what happens in practice. That was Gaza, not after October 7th. That was Gaza before October 7th. The head of the International Committee of the Red Cross was a fellow named Peter Maurer, M-A-U-R-E-R. And as you can imagine, his job as the head of the ICRC is to tour combat zones and to see the situation on the ground. After he left Gaza, following Operation Protective Edge, he said, quote, "I've never seen such massive destruction ever before. I've never seen such massive destruction ever before." Just to give you some basic comparisons. During Operation Protective Edge, the estimate is about 18,000 homes were destroyed. You know how many homes have been destroyed since October 7th? Remember, Peter Morris said, "I've never seen such destruction before." The estimate is over 300,000. Over 300,000. And Protective Edge was about 18,000. Now, some people will object and they'll say, what choice did Israel have? They were dealing with Hamas, that terrorist organization that's avowed to want to destroy Israel. What's the record? The record shows Hamas tried this diplomacy. A US government study during the period when Hamas was in power in Gaza. It said, quote, this is 2009, quote, Hamas has carefully and consciously adjusted its political program and sent repeated signals that it may be ready to begin, just one moment, it may be ready to begin a process of coexisting with Israel. That was Hamas. Like most radical organizations, when they come into power, they recognize that they're going to have to make compromises. And according to the US study and many other studies, I'm just quoting the US study, Hamas was ready, but Israel was not. Israel was not willing to accept anything less than, as our current president famously put it, unconditional surrender. Hamas, unable to achieve a diplomatic breakthrough with Israel, Hamas then attempted international law. Now, some of you may laugh that off, Hamas, international law, but that's the fact. After each of Israel's operations in Gaza, human rights organizations, the names will be familiar to you, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, they sent delegations to investigate on both sides, meaning Israel and Gaza, to investigate on both sides whether war crimes, crimes against humanity were committed, what is called violations of international humanitarian law, or what most of you know as violations of the laws of war. Each time Israel said, we're not cooperating. We're not going to even admit you. Each time, Hamas attempted to cooperate. Hamas admitted the delegations from the major human rights organizations and also the UN commissions of inquiry. Now, I've studied the matter closely. I dare say nobody on the planet Earth has studied it more closely than myself. Those reports were very critical of Hamas. In my opinion, they were overly critical. However, Hamas was willing to risk being branded war criminals. They were willing to risk it so long as they could extract some justice for the people of Gaza. What happened over and over and over again. The missions go, they produce voluminous reports, they document the horrendous war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Israel, and then the US and Israel acting, colluding together, they kill any action in the UN for the reports to turn into practical action. Nothing happens. They just collect dust, both at the UN and on my dust-laden bookshelves. So they tried diplomacy, dead end. They tried international law, dead end. So what's left? Here's a curious story. I had been strongly advocating at the time that they try nonviolent civil resistance. I thought it might work, nonviolent civil resistance, along the lines of Gandhi in India, but also our own civil rights movement. And lo and behold, a group of people in Gaza, they said we're going to try nonviolent civil resistance. They organized in March 2018. How many of you were alive in you were all alive in 2018. I can't do the math at this point in my life, because the distance between me and you is like between here and Jupiter. So, okay. And they organized what was called the Great March of Return. How many people remember that? Okay, not a bad showing. The Great March of Return. And one of the principal objectives of the Great March of Return was to lift that medieval barbaric blockade of Gaza. That was one of their aims, one of their principal aims. So what happened? I should point out, I said the people of Gaza independently came up with this idea, and then Hamas supported it. It gave moral support and practical support, things like supplying buses so they can bring people to the border with Israel. What happened? We know exactly what happened. No mystery. The UN Commission of Inquiry, it produced a 220-page, single-spaced report, very dense, very dense. What do we learn in the report? We learned the following. Israel, in its own words, deployed specially trained snipers in order to ensure accurate and measured use of live ammunition. That's Israel's words. Along the border fence between Gaza and Israel, they lined up their best snipers. in order to ensure accurate and measured use of live ammunition. Subsequently, they stated regarding what happened during the Great March of Return, quote, "Nothing was carried out uncontrolled. Everything was accurate and measured. And we know where every bullet landed." So no pretense here of fog of war. No pretense here of error or accident or collateral damage. There were the snipers, their best trained snipers. Each of them took aim. Each of them hit their target. That's Israel's words. Okay? So who were the targets? The Commission of Inquiry found that, quote, "Demonstrators who were hundreds of meters away from the Israeli forces and visibly engaged in civilian activities were intentionally shot. Journalists were shot. Health workers were shot. Children were shot. Women were shot. Persons with disabilities were shot. Who was shot? Mohammed Obeid, a 24-year-old footballer, took out his telephone and began recording a selfie video. An Israeli sniper shot him in the right side of his right leg as he filmed himself approximately 150 meters from the separation fence. The bullet passed through his right leg and hit his left leg just above the knee, shattering the base of his femur. He was standing alone. The area was quiet and calm. Mohammed was speaking calmly and filming himself when the ISF Israel Security Forces sniper shot him. Yosef Krones was a 19-year-old student journalist when he attended the demonstration. He wore a blue press vest and carried his photography equipment. He sat cross-legged on top of a sand dune to take photographs of the demonstrators. He was at least 800 meters from the separation fence. As he stood up, the ISF, Israeli Security Forces, shot him with 2 bullets in immediate succession, which hit him in the right knee and the left knee. Yosef's right leg was later amputated. Abed Hawartri was a 41-year-old man. The ISF shot him in the abdomen. Abed was standing near the back of a crowd when shot, with nothing in his hands. He was taken to the hospital and died the same day. A 16-year-old boy climbed onto high ground, approximately 300 meters from the separation fence. He was distributing sandwiches to demonstrators. The ISF then shot him in the face with a single bullet, which entered his nose and exited his skull. As a result of his injuries, he had a fractured jaw, is deaf in one ear, and is unable to taste or smell. Naji Abu Hojair was a 25-year-old mechanic. An ISF soldier shot him in the abdomen. He died the same day. Naji was standing 300 meters from the separation fence when he was shot. He was wrapped in the Palestinian flag surrounded by hundreds of people. Fadi Abu Salmi was a 29-year-old double amputee. The ISF shot him in the chest. He died immediately. The ISF shot him as he sat in his wheelchair under a tree, approximately 250 to 300 meters from the separation fence with two friends. Well, unsurprisingly, the Great March of Return gradually deteriorated into violence and then fizzled out. What are the conclusions? Each and every avenue Hamas ventured on to free Gaza from the thraldom proved to be a dead end. By 2023, Gaza, it's forgotten now, but by 2023, just before October 7th, Gaza had vanished from the stage of international politics. Nobody talked about Gaza before October 7th. Even myself, I had written several books on Gaza. I tried to be persistent. I tried to be stubborn. But by 2023, I had decided it's a done deal. Gaza is finished. And I gave up. I stopped writing on the subject. I didn't lecture on it because nobody was interested. And I started to read and write about other topics. So, for those of you who remember, in that period, all the talk was whether the Saudis would join the so-called Abraham Accords, and were that to come to pass, there would be all of these pacts and agreements above the heads of the people of Gaza. And Gaza's fate would have been sealed as a God-forsaken, forgotten patch of land. For the people of Gaza, for the young men, as in this room, what did they have to look forward to? Well, we already know what they had experienced in the past. They were born into a concentration camp. They languished in a concentration camp. And if things continued, they would die in that camp. 60% of Gaza's youth were unemployed. It was the highest youth unemployment in the world. And all they had to look forward to was to get up in the morning and pace those 26 miles by 5 miles of Gaza. That's it. With no hope whatsoever that something would change. Well, were it not for October 7th, it was almost certain that those young people in Gaza who burst its gates on October 7th, 2023, it was almost certain that they would just die in the concentration camp. Now, nobody will quarrel that nothing can justify committing a genocide in Gaza. However, I would add, it's my opinion, that after what Israel had done to the people of Gaza, they had forfeited any moral right to self-defense. That right was forfeited by what they had done to the people of Gaza. They had no more right to self-defense than the slave South had a right, as it did, to hang Nat Turner. Thank you. Now, I promised I would take questions. So for those of you who would like to ask a question, now is your opportunity. You are pointing to something. Oh, yes. Yes, I think he was pointing to you.
Okay, you said that.
I think because we don't have a roving mic yet, it might be better if you stood up and maybe you should stand up and just come over here and we can just share the mic.
All right. You said that Israel. Okay. You said that Israel no longer has a right to defend itself. I mean, it lost its moral right to self-defense. Then I guess my question to you and to anybody who is Palestinian or who is in solidarity with the Palestinians, up to what point should you attack Israel until you feel that there's justice?
I believe they don't have a right to self-defense any more than I believe if a battered woman, a woman who has been battered for 20 years, if at some point when she's threatened with battery again, she takes a knife and plunges it once, twice, and 3 times into her spouse, the batterer. Under our law, if he took out a gun at that point and killed her, he would probably get off in our legal system as it's currently constituted. I don't think he has a moral right to kill her. He forfeited that right after 20 years of battery, and after she made every attempt to try to seek outside help, which is what Gaza did. And every possibility, she exhausted all possibilities. Now, your question is, if they forfeited the right to self-defense, how far does the people of Gaza or that battered woman, how far does their right or her right extend? How far does it extend? My answer would be international law. And international law, whether you agree with it or not, and I would say at this particular moment, things are in flux with regard to that law. But you know what? I think that's a tough question. I'll be honest with you. I think that's a tough question. How far does their right extend after experiencing this horror for 50 years? I would have to think that question through. I don't have an answer at this point. But I think there is a distinction between there's a distinction between your right in a situation of desperation, which I believe is what caused October 7th, a situation of desperation. And if that desperate situation passes, if the UN had taken action, for example, to stop the genocide, if it just had done that, then I would say the people of Gaza, their rights are less if the UN had acted, but it didn't. So, and it didn't before October 7th. There were so many UN commissions of inquiry, and they all found Israel guilty of so many war crimes and crimes against humanity. And it didn't act. Had it acted, I suppose the rights of the people of Gaza would have been fewer. But if you want to know, that's my opinion with Iran. I don't want to get off on a separate subject, but it's related. Namely, the attack on Iran on February 28th of this year was the most brazen, flagrant, egregious breach of international law since the founding of the United Nations. It was. But then if you turn to the Security Council debates, with the exception of Russia and China, everybody was blaming Iran. The Russian representative, he said it's as if the British and the French are operating in a parallel universe. He said it was like, referring to Alice in Wonderland, he said it was like through the looking glass. What people were saying in the UN, blaming Iran? The most blatant, flagrant, egregious breach of international law since the founding of the UN. Israel and the United States didn't even pretend that they had a pretext. Every state always pretends when it launches an aggression, it always pretends that it's engaging in self-defense. They manufacture incidents, claim they were attacked. Nobody claimed Iran had launched an attack. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, you have the right to self-defense in the event of an armed attack. A-R-M-E-D. There has to be an armed attack for you to exercise your right to self-defense. The closest we got to the claim of an armed attack was that person currently, it's not really a person, it's a retarded ape, currently occupying the Oval Office, who said, I felt in my gut that Iran was going to attack in 2 weeks. No, Mr. Trump, you're not allowed to attack a country because you have this feeling in your gut. So at that point, international law had collapsed. And for those of you who've read the classic philosophers of the 19th, 18th century, we had entered what they called the state of nature. We were no longer in the state of law. And Iran, under those circumstances, had every right to do whatever it wanted to fend off the armed attack by what John Locke called, the philosopher, the English philosopher, what he called the wild beasts. These are wild beasts. If the UN had acted, I would say Iran has to wait to see what the UN does. But when there's a complete absence of law, then you have the right to do whatever you want in order to survive. And I think that's correct in the case of Gaza, and I think it's correct in the case of Iran.
Testing. All right, this is working. All right, let's get a couple more questions. I saw your hand earlier.
Given the current decimation of Hamas as a fighting force, do you believe that there is a future for armed resistance in Palestine? And if so, from where would it even muster?
I never believed there was much prospect of armed resistance in Gaza because the inequities in power are just too great. That was one of the reasons why I thought nonviolent civil resistance could work. It didn't. I have to be honest about that. It didn't. When you have an occupying power that puts snipers along a fence and shoots double amputees, the prospects of nonviolent civil resistance are very minimal. If that had happened during our civil rights movement, and I'm old enough to remember it and to have passed through it, the civil rights movement would have collapsed into armed resistance very quickly. Now, it's true, people were killed, but the national government at the time, what was, for those of you who don't remember, the Lyndon Baines Johnson administration, they condemned the killings, what was called the killings in Birmingham Sunday of 4 children being killed. And there were many killings, no question about that. But the government was officially on record as opposing it. That wasn't the case with Israel. By the Israeli government's own admission, every bullet hit its target. There were no errors. That's what they said. So, I don't believe there was a prospect of violent resistance, and I don't know where things are headed now. But I'm not going to blame the victim. That's not going to happen. And you ask yourself a simple question. The Nat Turner Rebellion was very bloody. No question about it. Many innocents were killed. The order was kill all white people. How many of you would condemn Nat Turner? You may say what happened was terrible, and I think what happened was terrible. But how many of you would condemn a slave? I'm not condemning a slave. And the conditions in Gaza were certainly comparable to, and at certain points worse than, the condition of slavery. Certainly during those high-tech killing sprees. I think we have a few more people, you, and then you, and then you. That's, okay, go ahead.
Can everyone hear me from here without me needing the mic?
Yeah.
Okay. So by your definition of losing the right to self-defense,
Forfeiting it.
Israel has forfeited their right to self-defense.
Mm-hmm.
Would I be correct in believing that the police departments of the United States of America have forfeited their rights to self-defense because of the violence they've unleashed on the black communities here, and the United States federal government has lost its right to self-defense because of the violence it's unleashed in Iran?
I don't agree with that because I was trying to be very careful in my language. Thank you so much. It's not as if our judicial system has completely collapsed. If it had completely collapsed and there was no possibility of any justice being achieved, then I would say yes, we've returned to the law, state of nature, or most of you young people, you will know as the expression, we've returned to the law of the jungle. I will grant that, but I don't think we're there. I think I recognize a lot of injustice occurs in the criminal justice system. I have no illusions about that. I think it's very different in the case of Israel. The whole system. It's not the system that's the problem. The problem is it's the whole society. It's a society of homicidal maniacs. The whole society, that's the problem. There's no possibility of legal recourse in that place. They are, in Locke's words, it's a nation of wild beasts. Now, if there were a larger power that tried to rein them in, to curb them, then, as I said, the rights of resistance diminish to the extent there's a larger power willing to rein them in. But when there's not, when nobody rose to Iran's defense and simply said, we don't care if you like the government or not, under international law, that's a war of aggression. There wasn't even a pretense of self-defense. When Iran was left on its own to defend itself, and when it was stipulated after a couple of weeks that we are going to destroy all of Iranian civilization, and you're telling me they don't have a right to self-defense? They don't have a right to do everything and anything in their power to stop these wild beasts? No, they have that right. Of course they have that right. Anybody with the moral faculty of a 5-year-old understands they have that right. So, believe me, well, I shouldn't say believe me, you should never believe. That was not the first straw. Do you know what happened in November 17th, 2025? On November 17th, 2025, the UN Security Council met. They passed Resolution 2803. You know what Resolution 2803 did? It gave the deed of Gaza. This is not an exaggeration. I'm very careful with my words. When you asked me a question, I wasn't sure, I stopped. I'm very careful with my words. They gave the deed of Gaza to Donald J. Trump. That's a fact. They gave him Gaza. That's a fact. They gave him the deed to Gaza. If Gaza's people have not suffered enough, the deed to their homes, to their lives, to their futures, the deed was handed to a retarded ape. That's what happened. It's a complete and total collapse of international law. And I don't believe we've reached that stage in our country. Our country's been a mixed picture. It's true that thing in the White House has been on the offensive. But it's also true, in some cases, the Supreme Court has reined him in a little. There are judges who have made decent decisions, including, as I was informed on the way up here, the young woman who spoke here, I understand, a few weeks ago, who had been incarcerated for a year, the Palestinian woman, and She did get released. The judge finally released her. And also the people. It's forgotten already. It just passed so quickly. But when ICE was on the offensive, in Minnesota, ordinary white Midwesterners rose up and fought ICE in ways which are really, honestly, they were really heroic. They were going right up to the face of the ICE people who were killing folks. They were killing folks, and would call them Nazis, get out of here, you effing Nazis. That took real courage. How many of you could do that? Well, I suspect quite a few, I believe, in those circumstances would probably do it. But you understand, for an ordinary Midwesterner, doing it not for themselves, they're doing it for undocumented workers. That was real courage. Israel, half of Israelis explicitly stated in the survey they support killing everybody in Gaza. The question was asked of Israeli Jews, if the IDF enters a city, should it kill everybody in the city? That's the question. If the IDF enters a city in Gaza, should it kill everyone? Nearly half said yes. That's a fact. Every public opinion poll from October 2023 to the ceasefire, every public opinion poll showed that 95% of Israelis, 95% of Jewish Israelis, 95% believed Israel was using either sufficient force or not enough force. 40% said not enough force. Only 5% of Israeli Jews, only 5%, said Israel was using too much force. Another public opinion poll asked all Israelis, not just about 20% of the Israeli population is non-Jewish, asked, are there any innocents in Gaza? Are there any innocents in Gaza? 64% said no. Remember, Gaza is 48% children. 64% said no innocents in Gaza. If you separate out non-Jews in Israel, it comes to between 70 and 75%. Said no innocents in Gaza. So we aren't there, in answer to your question. We aren't there, so I wouldn't compare the two situations. Yes, I think there were several here. I understand, they've prepared food, and I don't want to. Oh, what time is it now?
It's 7.
Oh, okay.
2 more questions. I'll have one last one.
Okay, one and then one on this side. Go ahead.
May I use the mic?
Sure.
Yeah, come on. I got it.
Oh, you had 2 mics.
We just got another.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Switch.
Hello? All right. So, I'm really glad that Iran came up as a topic today because it is home to the second largest population of Jewish people in the Middle East, outside of course, Israel. And
No, folks, let him answer. Let him ask the question the way he would like to ask it. I think that's fair. And then you have the right to stand up and say, I don't agree, but he has the right to ask the question as he wants to say it.
And it was April 7th, I was just looking up, the synagogue, it's called Rafi Nia, R-A-F-I hyphen NIA NIA in Tehran was blown to smithereens by the IDF. Thankfully, no one died in that particular incident. But I say this to ask, because of the fact that Iran it's not even close. Third place is about 4 or 5 times, I forget which country, the size of the Jewish population in Iran. I say this to ask, to what extent is Israel's insistence on being the one and only Jewish state part of the problem of its tension with the rest of the world?
There are many problems with many states in the world, including our own, for sure. The problem, I believe, with Israel is it's done with complete impunity. There's no accountability. And as anybody in this room knows, if you have a little brother or sister, who commits wrong deeds and never suffers punishment, that little tot turns into a monster. And the fact that Israel has never been held to account for anything, nothing, has turned the state into, there's a very good nuclear scientist and missile defense expert at MIT. His name is, anybody know? Theodore Postal. He's been doing a lot of interviews on the situation in Iran. And Postal is Jewish, and he does have clearly a sense of identity with Israel. He did an interview about 2 months ago, and he kept referring to Netanyahu. He kept referring to him as, quote, that homicidal maniac. The problem is that homicidal maniac is the longest sitting prime minister in Israeli history. Now, for those of you who even go back 10 years, you will remember that every few months they say, Netanyahu's finished, Netanyahu's out, this is the end of Netanyahu, his coalition is collapsing, the polls show he has no support. But like that camp song, which probably none of you have ever heard, there's a song that goes, the cat came back, it wouldn't go away. You know that song? Oh, I was pointing to you because you were smiling. That's Netanyahu, he keeps coming back. And you know why he keeps coming back? Because he's a perfect reflection of Israeli society. When they vote for him, they're voting for themselves. He's an obnoxious, self-righteous Jewish supremacist. That's all of Israeli society. And I think any people who were treated with impunity the way Israel has, everything I described to you in a few brief minutes, I could write books on what's been done to those people in Gaza. In fact, I have. Was there any accountability? Was there anyone who served a week in jail? No, nothing. So it's unsurprising that it's turned into a completely lunatic society, not state. A totally lunatic society. Yes.
Do you believe that Hamas was created by Israel? That's part one. And part two, which is what you hear once in a while.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second part is, do you think October 7th was orchestrated also by Israel in order to justify the genocide?
No. Hamas was favored for a period by Israel because they thought it would be a counterweight to at that time, the Palestine Liberation Organization. But Hamas is of home growth. It is. I don't want to sing its praises. I don't think I would survive very well under a Hamas regime, and not just because I'm Jewish, but for other reasons. However, the fact of the matter was, the reason they were elected in 2006 is while out of power, I'm not going to talk about them when they got into power, out of power, they were very honest. They ran all of these charitable institutions. They were honest, they were simple, they were dedicated, and that's why they won the elections. People didn't vote for them because they wanted to destroy the state of Israel. They voted for them because they ran on what was called a reform platform, because the Palestine Authority, the ruling group in that area, are hopelessly corrupt and only interested in their paychecks. So they voted for Hamas. If Hamas had been given a chance, I can't tell you how they would have evolved. I don't know. But there was a possibility that they would have evolved in a positive direction. You know, I think there's a real problem with your generation. I'm not speaking about your generation, but here, because your generation is totally consumed by conspiracy theories. And, you know, you hear nowadays by a lot of people, that Israel assassinated John F. Kennedy. No, I'm waiting for them to say that Israel assassinated Abraham Lincoln. It's become completely bizarre. The Israelis, and they wouldn't be the first, they got too full of themselves, and they relied, it turned out, excessively on their cutting-edge technology, and Hamas fooled them. I don't think you need a complicated conspiracy theory for what happened on October 7th. Now, don't get me wrong, conspiracies do happen. I recognize that. But to say conspiracies do happen is of a different order than saying everything is a conspiracy. And your generation, for various reasons, has been, I think, totally seduced by these conspiracy theories, which have no basis whatsoever in reality. I've listened to people like Tucker Carlson, and I've listened to Candace Owens, and I've listened to a lot of folks of that ilk. And I think a lot of what they say about Israel and American Jews, I think is true. And that's regrettable, but true is true. My credo in life is never quarrel with facts. But then, on top of what's true, there is super added all of these crazy, loony conspiracy theories, which have no basis, so far as I could tell, in reality. And on that note, I know you didn't come for the talk, you came for the food, so I'm going to cede my place to the chefs.
There's actually, if you have time, one more question on behalf of a lot of students on this campus. So, NJIT, the campus that we're on currently right now, hires IDF veterans and has an active partnership with Ben Gurion University, but denies the right of the students of having an established student organization named the Students for Justice in Palestine, the SJP. There are also faculty and staff within the administration and on this campus, professors, who target these students through emails behind the scenes, which are public records, by the way, saying that connecting these students to Hamas and ISIS and quote-unquote Islamic jihadists. My question to you is, which by the way, there is an active lawsuit that not only on the state level, but now on the federal level against the school for denying the students their First Amendment right. My question is what can these students do to stop administration from targeting Palestinians on this campus?
Okay, First of all, that's an important question. This is not a graduate seminar class. It's people who want to be informed and ultimately want to do something. So, my opinion is the following. With all due regard to all of you, and I recognize the risks that weigh on you, but I believe you are way, way, way too passive. 2 years ago, there was a huge wave of the student encampments in the spring of 2024. And they were having a big impact, no question about it. They had seized the headlines and they were spreading like wildfire. And they enjoyed overwhelming support by those who didn't actually participate in the encampments. Professors were sending them food. Everybody was trying to participate in this very hopeful moment. And then it vanished. It vanished when a Jewish supremacist billionaire class started to blackmail university administrations, saying, if you don't crush the encampments, you're not getting our alumni money. And in the big universities, there was a lot of money. You'd be surprised. Even a Bill Ackman, who played a very active role, a billionaire, he gave $50 million to Harvard. But if you read a Harvard report on anti-Semitism, other Harvard Jewish alumni gave, believe it or not, $200 and $300 million. There was a lot of money on the line. And because of that blackmail, all the administrations capitulated. One after another, after another, after another. It was a row of dominoes. They all capitulated, and it was breathtaking. After the encampments, till today, complete silence. Complete silence in the college campuses. On the question of Gaza, everybody is terrified, terrorized, and terrified of the consequences. On the question of the IDF soldiers, you're free to disagree with me, of course. Harvard says we have to be, Harvard in its report on anti-Semitism, it said we have to be an inclusive and pluralistic community, because it said all of these Israeli Jews are being ostracized on our, meaning Harvard's campus. I say, I will not be inclusive of child killers. That's not going to happen. You have every right to not be inclusive and pluralistic of child killers. And I think it heaps contempt on the dead to fraternize with folks like that. Sorry. You were part of a genocidal army. We're not going to the Pope. That's not going to happen. On the question of what you can do, concretely, when does your semester end? 2 weeks. I've been saying it for a couple of years now. The battle now is very simple. You've got to wrest back, seize back that right to free speech. That right was lost in the spring of 2024. That right was lost. And your first order of business has to be to regain that right to free speech. Without free speech, everything else is dead in the water. Can't do anything without that right. What should you do? In my opinion, you should make 500 t-shirts and just the word Gaza on it. Let them try to stop you. And then the next week, another t-shirt, Gaza, and on the back, genocide. Let them try to stop you. That would cost you $10, 2 t-shirts, but would be a beginning of a campaign to win back your free speech. I think it could work. My school, Brooklyn College, where I'm currently teaching, it was announced that the students wouldn't walk on the seniors, the graduating seniors wouldn't walk on graduation. And they came up with this excuse. I said, why did they do that? Why did they cancel, when you all walk up to get your diploma? And I was told because last year students had Palestinian flags. I said to the students, you should walk. I don't care what the school says, it's your graduation, not theirs. You earned the degree, you paid the money. You should just organize to walk. As I said, I recognize the dangers, and people told me on the way here, people feeling worried about their careers. Well, as you know, the cliche, there's always strength in numbers. 500 of you wearing the t-shirt, you'll have a problem. I admit if it's 1, you'll probably get expelled, I know that. 500, I don't think so. 1,000, they can't do anything. And you should just cast it for the whole campus. This is not about Gaza at the moment. It's about free speech. And if you cast it in those terms, I think you can win over 90% of the campus. For better or for worse, and I think for better, free speech is a sacred principle in our country. People resonate to that. And if you cast it as free speech, I think you can win a significant victory, even in the next 2 weeks. So, that's a practical suggestion.
All right, before we get to the food, I know you guys are all hungry. Just one more time, give a round of applause for Dr. Finkelstein for coming all the way here. Thank you once again. Real quick, before I talk about the food, I know you guys are all waiting. Tomorrow we do have another event where we have a software engineer from Microsoft coming to speak about her time over there, where she created the Palestinian Coalition within Microsoft and left due to their complicity in aiding technology to Israel to aid their genocide. So that will be at 2:30. We have flyers on every single table if you guys are interested in joining that. I would also like to give a shout out to Ken Zaman for donating the food that you have here today, and Crispy Crunchy and Ala Bistro. Just so everybody is comfortable, I please ask for the women to be served on this side and for the men to line up and be served on this side, just to ensure the comfortability of everybody here. Thank you so much once again.